Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and warm greetings to all of you. Welcome to today's session of IPRI's webinar series. Today we have a timely discussion on the subject, Has the Forever War Ended? The Way Forward for Afghanistan. We are fortunate to have with us 4 distinguished speakers today. Before we commence the session, please allow me the pleasure of introducing our panel. Our first speaker will be Lieutenant General Naim Lodhi. Lieutenant General Naim has served on various command, staff, and instructional assignments in his career in the Army, including the important appointments of directing staff at National Defense College and Commander Corps Engineers. Lieutenant General Naim Lodhi has also served as the Defense Secretary. On account of his distinguished military service, he has been conferred the award of Hilal-e-Imtiyaz Military. We are also joined by Ambassador Richard Olsen, a dignitary who has served in the U.S. Foreign Service and has held key posts as U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan and the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. His Excellency has been a recipient of multiple awards and honors, including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, a Presidential Distinguished Service Award, as well as the Medal of Wazir Akbar Khan by President of Afghanistan. Our third speaker today will be Ambassador Riyaz Mohammad Khan. Ambassador Riyaz has spent nearly 4 decades in Pakistan's foreign service. Some of his key posts include serving as Pakistan's foreign secretary and Pakistan's ambassador to China. His Excellency has also been ambassador to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union. The last but not the least speaker that we have with us today is Lieutenant General Amir Riyaz, the Hilal-e-Imtiyaz Military. Lieutenant General Amir has held varied command, staff, and instructional experience, including as Brigade Major of Independent Mechanized Brigade Group, Commanding Officer of Frontier Force Regiment, and Commander Independent Infantry Brigade Group. On the instructional side, he has been on the faculty of School of Infantry and Tactics and Command and Staff College, Quetta. He has also served as President of National Defense University. I thank all of our speakers for being here with us today, and we look forward to hearing more from you as we commence with the program. I would now kindly request Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mahin. I welcome all the distinguished panelists and hope that we have a very absorbing and engaging discussion. Afghanistan issue has recently attained fresh attention due to President Biden's announcement of US troops withdrawal by September this fall. The long war that the United States has been mired into appears finally to be getting over for the US troops on the ground and the policymakers in Washington. The comparison of war weariness faced by American policymakers and troops on ground makes for an interesting case study. The United States has spent over $1 trillion on this conflict, as per a Brown University report, incurring 2,300 fatalities and 20,600 casualties. The above cases led to a cost-benefit introspection amongst the political leaders in the United States, and questions being asked as to the rationale of this long war vis-a-vis the vital United States national security strategic objectives. The US domestic political realities shaped a change in the Afghan policy, with a rare consensus amongst Republicans and Democrats about the political and economic feasibility of the war. With nation building as a lot, the counterterrorism policy also received a critical lookover, making US troops deployment in Afghanistan unfeasible. What has led to this war weariness for Americans is a combination of factors, including a reappraisal of the national security threat profile, privileging global power competition over regional entanglements, a realization that counterterrorism project was over and was best served in future through offshore strategy. And last, but certainly not the least, what TV Paul calls the asymmetry of will in an asymmetric war. It was not the asymmetry of resources, but an asymmetry of will that compelled the United States to call off its Afghan project. So therein lies a question for all of us today to discuss. Is the Afghan war really over for belligerents who believe that they are winning the wars because of their ability to launch an armed struggle? When Taliban in the Afghan fray believe that they have a better chance to force the issue through bullet instead of ballot, would they be amenable to a political solution? Would Afghanistan be left to its own devices after US withdrawal and private security contractors' departure? Another issue worth discussing is the Afghan willingness to reach a consensus through intra-Afghan dialogue. Will that dialogue yield any consensus about the Afghan interim government, or the Taliban wait out the peacemakers till Americans left and then forced the issue through brute force as heretofore? Now, what leverage do the regional countries like Pakistan, Iran, China, and Russia have on the Afghan faction's ability to forge a consensus on the future constitutional scheme of political power sharing in Afghanistan? What is the possibility of ideal power sharing arrangement, and what are the potential spoilers to peace? What is the role of international community and regional powers to shore up the Afghan economy, which is dependent and suffering what the physicians call the war economy cirrhosis? Now, with these few introductory remarks, I would open the discussion by inviting Ambassador Riyaz Mohammed Khan to educate us about the present Afghan peace process and post-US withdrawal scenarios. So over to you, Ambassador Riyaz.
Ambassador Riyaz, if you could kindly unmute yourself.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua Sahib, for inviting me to this very distinguished panel for discussion on Afghanistan. I was hoping that I'll follow the other speakers so that I may learn and I may have some better ideas, but you have asked me to initiate the discussion. So let me say one thing. First of all, it is very difficult to predict anything about Afghanistan. Only 3 years ago, 2018, one of the chairman Joint Staffs Committee of United States told me that there is only one man in Washington who wants to pull out of Afghanistan. Now, after 3 years, we find that that gentleman has gone, replaced by another gentleman in the White House, and he has very strongly pursued the same policy. At that time, 3 years ago, I had thought that probably the Americans are going to leave a residual force. They will not leave lock, stock, and barrel. But this seems to be now the situation that they want to leave completely and let the Afghans sort out things for themselves. And from outside, they will, of course, exert their influence. I also agree with what appeared in today's Dawn, and I think it is General Miley, another chairman chief of a staffs committee, who has said that it is very difficult to predict or to say anything with certainty about the future of Afghanistan. Now, let me say that the Taliban victory over Kabul, which would be the central focus for all those who are in this power struggle in Afghanistan, that cannot be taken for granted. And I say on the basis of the earlier history of Afghanistan, you would recall that between 1989, February 1989, when the Soviets left, and December 1991, the Mujahideen at that time, they were not able to succeed in dislodging Najibullah. It was only after the Soviet Union collapsed that Najibullah's own commanders decided, either with Gulbuddin Hikmatyar or with Ahmad Shah Massoud, and the government of Najibullah collapsed. And then we saw a bitter struggle for Kabul mainly between Ahmad Shah Massoud and Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. Now we come to mid-90s, when the Taliban were able to dislodge Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they were able to occupy Kabul. At that time, the situation of Afghanistan was very different. It was completely insular, isolated, and the Taliban were able to move. The mobility was quite incredible. And if you look at the siege of Kabul by the Taliban in 1995, they used to move in the strength of 5 to 10,000 Taliban, and they were highly mobile, that sometimes they would be near Kabul, sometimes they would move away to Jalalabad, come back, etc. Now, under the present circumstances, when the eyes of the world are going to remain on Afghanistan, what is happening, what happens there, will that kind of situation be possible? Will even the Americans be so disengaged that they would not be able to, for example, use their air force, even if they have completely withdrawn? So it seems that we cannot really say that Kabul will immediately fall in the hands of the Taliban. The other possibility is that there is a civil war in Afghanistan. I think, first of all, the situation again is different in the sense that the strongmen, call them warlords, call them whatever, but strongmen in other regions, like Mazar-e-Sharif, like Herat, like Badakhshan, like the Hazarajats, they are now better prepared than they were in the mid-90s, and they would be able to resist any pressures from the Taliban. Also, historically speaking, the focus for such power struggles have always been Kabul. So it would be most probably, if at all, there is a civil war that would be focused, in my view, on Kabul. One other factor is that today, unlike in the 90s, Iran and also India, they are far more engaged with the situation, as well as other countries, including the United States, as I said. Now the question is, what are the chances for peace and what are the chances for a civil war? Again, as I said, difficult to predict which way the situation will move. But on the positive side, which gives some hope that things may start moving towards peace, is that one, Taliban are no longer the same Taliban as of 1990s. They have seen the world. Doha was a very good venue for all these discussions, which made a large number of Taliban leadership exposed to the modern world. And I think many of them probably realize that the old ways, they cannot return to the old ways. Even, for example, Siraj Haqqani had written an op-ed in the New York Times soon after the 29 February agreement, in which he said that they believe in cooperation, they believe in education for women, etc. So what I'm saying is that the Taliban have changed. They do believe that there is a need for Afghanistan and for them to have international cooperation, lifting of sanctions, release of their prisoners, etc., etc. They need normal economic activity in the country. And a Taliban effort to take over Kabul through military means is certainly make them a bit isolated, and it would be at least a recipe for a prolonged civil war. They also cannot depend on Pakistan except for sanctuaries for their families, etc. Pakistan is absolutely no position to help them in any other way. And I'm sure that now Pakistan is very clear that the prolongation of this war basically costs Pakistan a lot. Now, on the negative side, first of all, we do not know about the motivation of the Taliban, foot soldiers, commanders. What are they thinking? Their internal dynamics and their internal divisions, whether the withdrawal of the Americans is going to boost their morale, or whether they are now sufficiently fatigued by the war, and they would be more interested in some kind of a dialogue, initiation of a dialogue. So first imponderable is this. Similarly, we do not know the thinking of the Northern Alliance leadership, which is quite dominant in Kabul today. There are elements who are viscerally against the Taliban. So will they adjust to any power sharing? And if at all, then power sharing of what kind? Power sharing for the Taliban has to be far more substantial. And here there are many big questions. Among big questions is, of course, first the question of constitution, whether it should be Islamic Emirate or it should be Islamic Republic, or the question of the Afghan army and NDS, the intelligence. How would you address that in a new power sharing structure, if at all there is movement towards that? So these are big issues. Apart from, of course, the question of women's rights, etc., where I'm sure that now the Taliban would be far more flexible as compared to their past, as far as cities are concerned. So there are these imponderables. Then there are the imponderables of what would be the role of Al-Qaeda. There are elements of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS. There are those elements. Then of the outside players, in which India, Iran, Pakistan, United States in particular. So that is very important. Would the economic incentives provided by United States in particular, and say China, Russia, will they help nudge the parties towards some kind of an intra-Afghan dialogue? Lastly, there is the important factor is the role of other groups in Kabul, other than the government in Kabul, and other than, of course, the Taliban. So these are some of the imponderables. What is necessary is, of course, that some kind of a coalition for peace develops, and it should not only include elements from the Taliban and the Kabul government, but also segments from the other Afghan groups, and that this takes shape and moves the peace process and works through some of the internal Afghan processes, apart from the international diplomacy through conferences, etc., held by China, Russia, others. So that is one thing. One thing that has become very clear is that the US forces must now leave, because their continuation will only be continuation of the status quo. And paradoxically, it would lend legitimacy to the Afghan, to the Taliban fighters more and more. So to break the logjam, they have to leave. They have the new schedule in September, and hopefully that will be realized. There is a possibility that left alone, the Afghans are able to work out among themselves a path towards peace. Now, in this, there is, lastly, I would say, the question of what should be Pakistan, and I would be very brief on that. I think, first of all, we are very clear now, and we should make it very clear that we have a great stake in peace in Afghanistan. We have become, our policies have become hostage, our development has become hostage to the Afghan war and conflict for the last 40 years now. We missed out on globalization. We missed out on so many other opportunities. Nonetheless, there's no gainsaying that we have a stake in peace in Afghanistan. Secondly, we should make it very clear to all that we are not party to, we will not be party to any civil war effort. We will not stand with one side or the other in case there is a civil war. We will certainly not push the Afghans out of Pakistan. We will not push the Taliban families out of Pakistan. That is not possible because of the cultural overlap, all the factors that we all know very well. But we should ask the Taliban leadership, after the Americans leave, that they must move all their activities inside Afghanistan. There would be absolutely no justification for them to have their headquarters or whatever inside Pakistan. That should not be there. So these are some of the ideas. One thing that I may say lastly, that Pakistan should not be pushing for any ideas of its own. For example, we may think that an interim government would be a good idea. But I'm quite sure that if we push for this kind of an idea on our own, then one party or the other, important party among the Afghans, is going to look at it with suspicion. So we should not be keen in pushing our own ideas. We should help, we should try to nudge all the parties towards peaceful, but it should be, now, you know, it has become a cliche, Afghan-owned, Afghan-led, and the Afghans sometimes get upset about this. But the thing is that it has to be mainly worked by the Afghans and by others. We are seen by some of the Afghans as a party. And lastly, I would say United States has an important role, especially for economic engagement. But there is one thing that we should be very cautious. If we are asked to provide bases, military bases, we must not get sucked into this war. We must not agree to that kind of arrangement. Of course, they have our airspace and they would need our land corridors. Airspace we cannot stop in any case. But apart from that, the question of bases, we should be very clear that anything we do on that count, that will basically suck us into that war. And that is the last thing that we need. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir, thank you very much. With the Pakistani perspective, so I would move over to Ambassador Olsen for his perspective on the present Afghan peace prospects and the role of United States post-US withdrawal in sustaining the economy and helping Afghanistan by way of an international consensus. Over to Ambassador Olsen, please.
Thank you very much, General, and Salam Alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to all of the viewers. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel, and thank you to IPRI for inviting me. As the American on the panel, I'd like to give the view from Washington and perhaps start by unpacking the Biden decision so that we have a very clear understanding of what it actually is, and then get into some broader implications. The first thing I would say about describing President Biden's decision is that it was in the context of a very difficult inheritance from the previous administration. There had been, of course, there had been a US Taliban agreement, the Doha Agreement of February of last year, but at the same time that had been somewhat undermined by President Trump's decision to have continual drawdowns, first to about 8,000 and finally to about 2,500 in terms of troop levels by the end of his administration. And despite the rhetoric about being conditions-based, this was actually done in response to, I think, political imperatives in the United States, or perceived political imperatives, and left, and I think somewhat weakened the government of Afghanistan's position. Secondly, the Doha Agreement imposed a May 1st deadline, as we're all aware. So the alternatives for this administration would have been either to stay, that is to, as Ambassador Riyaz described it, to maintain a residual force, but that would have meant breaking the Doha Agreement and going back to war with the Taliban. And in practice, that would have meant an escalation for the United States. It would have meant, in my view, I'm not a military man and I defer to all the generals on this panel, but it would have meant going from 2,500 US troops to probably at least 8,500 and perhaps up to 15,000, and with attendant casualties, because we would have been back at war with the Taliban. The other alternative that was out there, I suppose, was a brief negotiated extension of the deadline, which would have required making further concessions to the Taliban and probably weakening the government of Afghanistan even further. So given those very difficult set of decisions with no good options, the least worst option was the decision that was made to withdraw on our own timetable, because there was no possibility of maintaining the status quo. That is to say, we could not stay at 2,500 troops and maintain the peace with the Taliban that we have had up until now. I would say it was a close run thing, this decision. The president offered, in my view, two principal rationales for the decision, at least a foreign policy rationales. The first was that the reason for the U.S. going into Afghanistan in 2001 had been met. Al-Qaeda is degraded, and the threat from terrorism has transmogrified and dispersed since 2001. More important, I would say, from a geostrategic perspective, is, in the president's words, we have to be dealing with the challenges of the 21st century, including meeting the stiff competition we're facing from an increasingly assertive China. And I think this is the real strategic rationale for the withdrawal. That's my personal opinion. But first, let's talk about the counterterrorism. I think it would be, frankly, there was an ongoing debate in Washington as to whether the terrorism threat is in fact going to be diminished. I would say that many in the diplomatic, intelligence, and military communities would say that would dispute this and would say that the U.S. needs to maintain an insurance policy by maintaining some forces on the ground. Others would say that we have sufficiently hardened our homeland defenses since 2001 that we can run the risk of some degree of resurgence in Al-Qaeda, at least to the extent that it's burrowed in a future Afghanistan. In other words, I would say there were risks on both courses of action. And, to resort to a cliche, I think only time will tell on the terrorism front whether this is a live threat. But what I think it does show is that counterterrorism is not the principal framing device for U.S. policy as it was in the first decade of this century. Counterterrorism will continue to be important, but it will be more event-driven and not have the same central role that it has had 2 decades ago. More importantly, our methodology for terrorism now is not what it was in 2001. To put it just very bluntly, we no longer occupy countries and engage in nation building. The debacle in Iraq, I think, cured us of that. We have extensive counterterrorism operations around the world, but they are characterized by the slogan, by, through, and with local partners. And you can see examples in Syria, Iraq, and throughout Africa. In other words, we are unlikely, if 2001 happened today, if 9/11 happened today, we'd be unlikely to approach Afghanistan in the same way that we did in 2001. But turning to the question of great power competition, it seems to me that this is very much in the ascendance in US foreign policy. In some ways, this administration is implementing the Obama era pivot to Asia, which is to say, refocusing grand strategy away from the conflicts in the Middle East and South Asia and toward greater engagement with East Asia. And it is also represents a continuation of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. I think specifically that the military resources that have been used in a grinding counterinsurgency in Afghanistan need to be made ready for deterrence in the Western Pacific and other areas of concern. And a couple of examples of that. DoD leaders maybe were in favor of a residual presence of US forces in Afghanistan. But our services are moving forward with restructuring themselves for a potential East Asian conflict. I would note that the Marines are getting rid of their tanks and returning to amphibious traditions. And the Navy SEALs are shifting from counterterrorism to traditional maritime operations. And at a political level, some of our partners in the region, in East Asia in particular, have questioned why we have maintained such an expensive investment in Afghanistan for so little reward. In other words, this decision will allow us to focus our diplomatic and political efforts on a free and open Indo-Pacific region. I would say, more germane perhaps to the audience today, bringing an end to our military involvement in Afghanistan may also reduce friction in our relationship with Pakistan, which I would say has been dysfunctional for much of the past 20 years for the basic reason that I think we're pursuing contradictory goals with regard to Afghanistan when that occupied a central place in US foreign policy thinking. By contrast, for the past 18 months, we have had a rare degree of alignment between US and Pakistani views on Afghanistan in pursuit of the peace process. And I think it would be very important for us to continue to maintain that alignment. And I'll talk a little, maybe that's a good segue to talk about where the US sees itself going from now. The Biden administration, as part of its decision, has been at pains to emphasize that it believes it's going to continue to engage diplomatically and continue to provide full levels of assistance, both security assistance and development assistance, robust development and security assistance. On the diplomatic track, although the US is supportive of the ongoing Afghan peace negotiations between the government in Afghanistan and the Taliban, I personally am a little skeptical that much will come of those in the near term. And I would say that is frankly due, from my perspective, to Taliban intransigence. The Taliban has not really been prepared to engage on core issues, laying out its vision for what it sees in a post-settlement Afghanistan, and I think is somewhat biding its time as it perceives itself to be in the ascendance militarily. I saw this morning the Taliban has sent a letter to Abdullah and former President Karzai saying they're willing to talk, but this strikes me as an attempt to split the republic rather than a sincere attempt to engage in negotiations, but we'll see. I think the focus for the Biden administration is much more likely to be at the regional level, addressing the regional dimension to the conflict. In his speech, President Biden mentioned Pakistan, first and foremost, Russia, China, India, and Turkey as countries that had a role to play in stabilizing and bringing peace to Afghanistan. I would add Iran, which obviously may have been inconvenient for the president to have said in a speech, but I think is a reality. And I think the hope of the administration is to build on the recent Moscow statement which included language about no return of the emirate. And I think this does reflect a broad consensus, but fragile consensus within the region, that it is acceptable to see a Taliban ascendance, but not a return to the 1990s. I sense this consensus includes Pakistan, but other members of the panel would be better positioned to say that. I do think it's important for Pakistan in its own self-interest not to allow Taliban overreach right now. And I'm fully aware that Pakistan does not control the Taliban, but I think the message has to be from the region as a whole and from Pakistan in specific that it is important for the Taliban to reach an accommodation with its rivals rather than to attempt a military victory, which I think would result just in intensified civil war. I completely agree with Ambassador Khan on that. On assistance, the US has committed to continuing security assistance to the army, the Afghan army, and in the wake of the president's decision announced that it will seek an additional $300 million in civilian assistance, development assistance, and at the same time, more importantly, new contracts are in fact being let by USAID. All of this will ultimately be up to Congress, which has been very strong in signaling that any future assistance to a regime that it would include the Taliban, for instance, would be contingent on respect for the rights of women and girls and a continuing role for the civil society that has developed in Afghanistan. So I would say that all of this together suggests that the US has, at least the administration has absorbed the lessons of 1989, 1992, which Ambassador Khan reviewed. For the US, one of those lessons is that complete disengagement is a mistake. I have to say this is what the administration is proposing. Whether the Congress has learned that lesson is always a trickier question. But why don't I stop there, and I'll be delighted to take questions and comments later.
Right, so three takeaways from Ambassador Olsen's discourse. One is that United States shift in the grand strategy away from entanglements in Middle East and South Asia towards East Asia, and which impacts its military strategy and engagement with the regional countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan here. And the second is that the US engagement here onwards would depend on the behavior of the Afghan regime, whatever regime is there, with human rights, women issues and all that. So these are very interesting insights. So I would here request Lieutenant General Naeem Lodhi for his perspective on US disengagement and eventual post-US withdrawal scenario in Afghanistan. And what does he see? Is the Afghan riddle going to be solved the good old Afghan way, through the length and sharpness of the blade, or the Afghanistan, as we keep saying, has changed a lot after 2011? So over to Lieutenant General Naeem Lodhi for his perspective.
Thank you very much, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to our friend from America, Excellency Olsen. You've asked us the question that has the forever war ended? And we all know that war is an interactive phenomena, and this question can be better answered by those who are actually fighting. So one answer we have got, the American perspective, but the representative of Taliban, Afghan Taliban, is missing. So I don't know what do they have in their mind. But whatever we are saying, we will be saying, as Ambassador Coker also said, that is our assessment. And my premise of the analysis is purely based on the things which we have learned from Americans, Hans Morgenthau and Henry Kissinger, and that is national interests are the driving forces of all actions. At times, announcements may be different. So whereas the American announcement is that they don't want Afghan soil to be used for any future terrorist activity, but let me list some other American interests which are enduring, which are there. First amongst them is to prevent a very strong and deep Chinese influence in this region and their investments in Afghanistan and their influence in Afghanistan. They would not like Russia to use the route of Central Asian republics and then coming through Afghanistan and going to warm waters, either via Pakistan through CPEC or through Iran. Their third interest, and they have not minced any words about that. They would not like CPEC to prosper. They don't like the idea of CPEC, and they have said so very openly. I'm very happy. I like Americans for one, great quality, that they are upfront, they are candid, they say whatever they want to say, and because they are a great power, so they can afford to do that. Then they also have an interest that if they remain in this region, they have to have an eye on the nuclear activities of Iran, and even have they would like to see the nuclear assets of Pakistan. So China, Russia, Central Asian countries, Iran, Pakistan, CPEC, these are the additional interests, and some of them are quite important interests as far as US is concerned. So based on, I'll talk about other countries also, then I'll make my conclusions. About India, India has economic interest in Afghanistan, but they could only flower better if the Wagah route is open. And that way there's a bit of, you can say, stumbling block as far as Pakistan is concerned. But they have another very important military interest, and that is they keep on hitting Pakistan via Afghanistan, and they would like their ability to do that for as long as possible. So that interest should also be kept in mind. Afghan people, of course, they are weary, they are tired, they would like to have peace in Afghanistan. Ashraf Ghani, at the apex of the government, having Bollywood time for such a long time, and very clearly seeing that in any future dispensation, he cannot be the head of state. He may try his best. So what he would like, what is his interest? His interest is prolonging the present situation for as long as possible, so that he remains at the apex of the government. Pakistan's interest, we say that without peace in Afghanistan, there can be no peace in Pakistan. So naturally, we want peace, we want stable Afghanistan. And although our army chief said that we want a democratic and stable Afghanistan, I would not like to emphasize on the word democratic. From the Pakistani perspective, it can be any dispensation, as long as they are stable, as long as they are peaceful, we are happy with it. If they are friendly, that will be an added advantage. But whether they are democratic or autocratic or what, from my point of view, we are not concerned, and we should not be concerned. China, naturally, they have very strong economic interests in Afghanistan. They otherwise want to expand their influence because the BRI becomes more viable, and the contact with the CPEC becomes viable. Central Asian countries, they have a similar sort of interest in Russia. I've already talked. So keeping all these things in mind, my take is, one, United States is not leaving Afghanistan by their own sweet will. Although they are a superpower, if they wanted to stay back, they could have. But I think they calculated it very wisely that they are facing net politico-economic losses in Afghanistan. And they have made the right decision because this campaign, if I have to say, was a failure. It was not attaining anything from their point of view. So they have taken that decision. But US still wants to maintain a very strong influence in this region, and especially Afghanistan, and for the reasons that I've already listed. I've listed their interests, and if somebody wants to discuss that, no, this is not their interest or what, if those are their interests which I've listed, they would like to have a very strong influence to be left behind in whatever form, and we can discuss that later. Afghan government, the present Afghan dispensation, is no more after this ground situation changes, will be no more the representative of the people of Afghanistan. And I will not go into the details. I will just allude that the percentage of people who participated in the elections, the time which was taken to declare the result of the elections, then two contestants saying that I am the president. So I leave it at that. Afghan Taliban, in my opinion, will be the main stakeholders in any future political dispensation, whether we like it or not. And situation in Afghanistan, as my predecessors have also said, is not as it was 20 years ago. Many people think that there will be a vacuum, there should be a responsible withdrawal. Ladies and gentlemen, in 20 years back, when the USSR was defeated, they went, Americans went, and then there was a vacuum. Now, today, one that the Afghan Taliban have learned their lessons. They are in contact with many entities, and I'll come to that later. The Chinese are there. The Russians are there. Iran and Pakistan do not have that sort of antagonist, situation as it was 20 years back. So, in my opinion, the situation is not the same, and I think Ambassador Coker also alluded to that. Now, after saying all this, I think we can very clearly make out that who are the peace seekers as far as Afghanistan is concerned, and who are the obvious detractors. I'll just, I've already indicated, so I'll not like to name, but those who were having, who were attaining their interests in a way, they would not like to have a peaceful Afghanistan, whether they say it or they don't say it. A superpower with allies was here for 2 decades and could not create peace. I wonder if they wanted peace at all. Peace may have a chance if they actually leave without looking back. This is my assessment, I may be wrong. Afghan Taliban, and this is again my opinion, whatever clauses we have seen of the Doha Accord between United States and Afghan Taliban, taking that in view, Afghan Taliban, in my opinion, have not violated Doha Accord. US has mildly violated it. Afghan Taliban will not talk peace with Ashraf Ghani, this is my assessment. However, they are already talking to Abdullah, Hikmatyar, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, and even Karzai. And we all remember that there were at least 3 conferences in Russia, one 3 years ago, and then a year ago, and even recently. So also they have been visiting Pakistan one after another. So I'm quite certain that what I am saying is they're already in contact with all these entities. I would request that US should not push Pakistan to force Afghan Taliban into any talks that they are not willing to do, because Afghan Taliban are fiercely independent, and I don't think Pakistan has that leverage to actually push them to talk to Ashraf Ghani if they don't want to do it. Now, the way forward, the suggested way forward, in my opinion, is US should leave Afghanistan to its own machinations and not seek for a base in the region to keep fueling the fire. US established entities in Afghanistan, like some contractors and some other groups which I would not like to mention here. They must also leave, or they must stop their activities. India should remain away from the arena. And India, in my opinion, is a definite spoiler as far as Afghan peace is concerned. Grand Afghan Jirga, supported by Pakistan, China, Iran, and Russia, to decide about the future of the dispensation of Afghanistan. And that is, I think, that is what is likely to happen. The world should support financially and technically to enable Afghanistan to evolve into a stable state. Neighbors must desist from any interference, accept assistance when asked and the way it is asked. Now, this was all wish list, which I just narrated. The moment I factor in the interests of power to reckon with, what I foresee is a prolonged rearguard action by US, a short but intense power struggle, Pakistan and Iran positive role critical for peace, provided they feel confident, China capable and willing to provide economic support and investments. Central Asian countries, Russia may no more be fence sitters. India not likely to fall in the American trap and may stay visibly away from the battlefield except for intelligence intrusion, etc. Future coalition government likely to be Afghan Taliban heavy, but will have to accommodate all the important factions. So in my opinion, if this is the future picture of the Afghan government, if we all strive in line as far as these things are concerned, I think the peace will come earlier or it will be a bit delayed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would like some of your points highlighted by you to be responded by Ambassador Olsen. But before that, I'll go to Lieutenant General Amir Riyaz, who with his very rich repertoire of knowledge and perception, being an ex-DGMO also. So we would like to know from Amir Riyaz how the future scenarios would pan out after the US withdrawal, and what do you see the peace prospects and the consensus and the future power sharing arrangement in Afghanistan? Over to you, Amir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, IPRI, for giving me this opportunity to speak here. But it's always difficult to speak after three very enriched talks given by wonderful people out there, and almost all sorts of perspectives have been covered. I might be doing some repetition actually, and nothing much left to offer, but I'll start with unpacking this US decision of withdrawal. Very plainly, simply put, the situation had reached a point which we in the military call as the law of diminishing return. Any further stay of the US forces would have impinged on the situation negatively, not only for the US, but also for the peace process in Afghanistan. So this was the right decision to take. And this puts US in a position, gives the US an option to actually work in the positive way for achieving peace in Afghanistan. Obviously, a lot has been said about it, and we can talk about this during question answer session as well. But this can put US in a position where they can positively contribute towards achieving sustainable peace in Afghanistan. Had they stayed on, they would have been party to the conflict, and there was a problem. And then we have to unpack the conflict a little bit, how it was. It is a continuum of conflict since 1979 when the Soviets came into Afghanistan, and there has been a continuum of conflict. But what had happened was that after the Soviets left, there was an internecine struggle which began, and this struggle had not finished. This was still going on in 2001 once those unfortunate events of 9/11 took place. And then US-led NATO invasion in Afghanistan. Now this is here, the conflict became more complex because there was a civil war which was going on. It had not concluded, although Taliban were ruling from Kabul, but that conflict was still very much on. And then came 9/11, and then came this invasion of the Americans-led NATO invasion came there. So there were the situation became complex. Two things were happening at about the same time. External forces, as well as the internal conflict which was there, and installed, a government was installed, obviously a constitution was built, and things happened as the way they happened. But these were the two layers of conflict which was already now meshed in. Now the situation at this point in time is that perhaps if everything goes as has been said by our American friends and the withdrawal completes in September, we'll be left with just one layer of the conflict, and that is an ongoing. I don't say it is not going on. We have to understand that there is a civil war which is already going on. Taliban, for some period of time, had reduced violence and particularly stopped attacking the American forces after that agreement in Doha. But there was a struggle going on between the Afghan government forces and Taliban, which has not ended. They're trying to reduce violence, but it is still going on. So this is where we are at this point of time. Apart from this, there are several other things which have happened in these last 20 years, and my friends have already recounted them. The situation is not the same as it was. Afghanistan was abandoned completely. The Soviets went out and collapsed. The US simply and its allies looked the other way and moved away from this place, and the rest of the regional players did not have the capacity and perhaps they did not have the wherewithal to bring about that kind of a peaceful resolution to Afghanistan. Although people keep blaming Pakistan and so many other players that we did this and we did that, but actually it was the issue of lack of capacity of bringing about a stable Afghanistan. We had to settle with what kind of Afghanistan would become naturally, and that's how it was in 1995 till 2001. Now there is a very intense competition. And Ambassador Richard Olsen has alluded to it, and we all know it. It goes without saying that there is a power shift taking place. Unilateralism is going. There's a power shift which is taking place from the west to the east, notably towards China. And there is a power disequilibrium at this point in time. And we are all caught in between this. But this is a very important event which is happening right in front of our eyes. And how the Chinese and the Americans, do they have the wisdom and the grit and the determination to resolve it peacefully or not, will define a lot of things for this region and for the rest of the world as well. It will have an impact on Afghan situation. And of course, it is not the same Russia that we are dealing with now, which was in 2001. The Russians are resurgent both towards the west and the east. And they are, as of today, they are engaged in Afghan peace process and they're positively engaged. So Chinese obviously are engaged, and the Iranians and the Pakistanis and everybody else is engaged, and the situation is not the same. So I would like to substantiate that point, that the possibility of a vacuum or possibility of as somebody is trying to call in US and other places, they're writing it's an irresponsible. It's not. There's not going to be a vacuum. What is going to determine the outcome is that how the regional players play, how the internal actors play. If the Taliban are moderated, they're willing to for a give and take, and President Ashraf Ghani's government is also willing for a give and take. Erstwhile Northern Alliance, which is predominantly there in Kabul, they're also willing for some kind of a power sharing formula. And one has to understand, at this point in time, Taliban are an ascendant party at this point. They have struck a deal with the United States. The United States is going. Can you hear me, sir? Okay. So, so therefore, the internal actors in Afghanistan will determine whether they want peace or they want to descend into a chaos-like situation, which will resolve itself, and hopefully they will not fall into that situation. If they do, there will be a bloody war which will take place. There will be a lot of loss of life and livelihood in Afghanistan, and rebuilding process of Afghanistan will be that much more difficult. It will, I will recount, it will depend upon how the regional actors play their part, and that includes India. It is going to play a positive part or a negative part. The US, which is looking at China from a very different perspective. How are they going to look at Afghanistan from this larger perspective of dealing with China and Russia? And then the internal actors within Afghanistan, do they really understand that this is about time that they have to sit down and get around something to develop a system, maybe even the constitution has to be rewritten, and lots of other things will have to be done to bring about sustainable peace. Lastly, it will also start becoming quite evident, as they say, that the devil lies in the details. Now, once we understand, once the peace process will start, there will be, you put too many devils in the detail. Who puts it? I don't know. There are people who keep talking about too much about democracy, and this is good, this is fine. But the problem is that in last 20 years or so, very frankly speaking, the people in Afghanistan, maybe some haves in Kabul, they might be enchanted with this, but people in Afghanistan have not been delivered by this system. The system is almost negligible delivery to the people, and people on the street, maybe outside Kabul, they're not terribly enchanted by this buzz of democracy. So what needs to be done is a homegrown system which is suited for Afghanistan, and people have to be willing to accept that system. So if that happens, yes, peace has a chance. But I've already outlined the conflicting interests that are internally and externally. If we put too many devils into the details of the agreement, there will be problems. Who's going to put those devils in the detail of the agreement? That will become very obvious when the next rounds of talks start. And then eventually, my personal view is, my wish is that I would like peace to prevail and prevail quickly. And this is absolutely in the interest of Pakistan, in the interest of Iran, in the interest of China, Russia, Central Asian states, and even India. And if we look at maybe from a more humane perspective, it may also be in the interest of the United States if it becomes a partaker in peace as well as the economic development of this, and takes the dividends of economic development of this region as a whole. If it becomes partners in this. But as of now, I was actually quite amazed. In one of the last seminars, one of our very prominent American speakers said that American focus is from Wagah to Wellington. This leaves me actually quite, it's a very interesting statement that I'm sure you were there, sir. It was made by one of our ex-ambassadors there from US, that US focus is going to be from Wagah to Wellington. I understand he was talking about Quad, he's talking about Indo-Pacific, he's talking about so many other things. But I'm sure US has much greater scope of vision to look at the things in a different way. I will leave it at that. Thank you, sir.
One more thing before we move on. If everything doesn't go as per the plan, and there is an internecine conflict, what would be the impact of that civil war on Pakistan? And what steps should Pakistan take to position itself in a comfortable position when that occurs? I would like to get your...
Obviously, sir, it goes without saying that it is going to have a very terrible effect on Pakistan, because whenever something happens in Afghanistan, whenever Afghanistan goes into a civil war situation, first and foremost is that lots of people who lose their livelihood and they feel threatened, even in the countryside of Afghanistan, will come to Pakistan. And that brings very serious added burden on Pakistani security as well as Pakistan's economy. This is one. Second is that now we are at the brink of a time when we are talking about connectivity. We are talking about east-west, north-south connectivity. That will be delayed. And the dividends of peace in Afghanistan, which were to be taken not only by Pakistan, by Iran, by Russia, by Central Asian states, by the Chinese, and even by the Indians, if they want to, if they really want to become the beneficiaries of this, all this will be delayed, and the whole region will suffer for quite some time. But my hope is now one of the simple measures that Pakistan has to fend is, Pakistan has to strengthen its borders and all that. More than that, Pakistan has to develop an alliance, a positive alliance and a solid alliance for peace in Afghanistan with the regional stakeholders. And I think John Lodi has already said that we are not going to take part in this civil war, if it takes place. We will only take part in the peace process and assist our Afghan brothers to come to some kind of an understanding as early as possible with our other regional friends helping us. I think that's very clear to me, and I'm sure to all Pakistanis. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, General Amir. And with that, I'll come to Ambassador Olsen to respond to General Naeem Lodi's formulations about the competing interests in Afghanistan and how would those impact the peace there. Over to you, Ambassador Olsen.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to respond. Thanks to General Naeem for his thoughtful observations. I did want to make a couple of counter perspectives. Obviously, in my remarks, I emphasized the role of China in U.S. thinking, but I would respectfully suggest it's not in the way that General Naeem cast it with regard to Afghanistan, in which he suggested that we were somehow in a competition with China for influence in and from Afghanistan. If that were the case, the U.S. would not be withdrawing its forces. I mean, if there were certain people who made the argument that having a toehold behind, on the back end of China, on the western edge of China, would have been somehow useful in some sort of great game, and I think the president's decision puts paid to that idea. The issue for the United States with regard to China, in my view, is strategic prioritization and where we choose to deploy resources, especially military resources, which even for the United States are a scarce resource. If anything, I would say that our interests with regard to Afghanistan converge with Chinese interests. Over the years, we have tried to encourage China to take a greater role in economic development. Our position on China has hardened over time, and it's still a changing, a fluid, I would say, situation with regard to Afghanistan. But I don't think competition directly in Afghanistan with China is a huge factor. I think perhaps more so with Russia, in the sense that our interests converge less with Russia. I think Russia, and to some extent Iran, would be very happy to see a complete U.S. humiliation in Afghanistan. But I don't think anyone else in the region, including China, particularly wants to see that. Secondly, on the question of CPEC, the previous administration, as you correctly note, was quite critical of CPEC. My dear friend and colleague Alice Wells made herself quite popular in Islamabad with her remarks about CPEC. I suspect, I don't think the Biden administration has a position yet on this issue. I suspect it will be a more nuanced one. The general approach that the Biden administration is projecting with regard to all of the countries that have relationships with China through the Belt and Road Initiative is not to force a choice, because we know that if we attempted to ask partners to choose between the United States and China, we might not like the answer that they give, given the growth and preponderance of Chinese economy and the generosity of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that there will be an element of competition, but from the perspective of the United States, it's a question of choice. I think that's where the Biden administration will wind up. Do countries choose to go with the Chinese approach, or a more Western-oriented approach? And then finally, on the question of, I think General Naeem made a point that if we had wanted peace in Afghanistan, we would have been able to accomplish it. I really wish that were true. I think it has been the policy of the U.S. since 2011 to seek peace in Afghanistan. And I think it is very fair to say that the United States missed opportunities for peace in 2002 and 2003. I think that is a matter of historical record. There were people at that time who the Taliban wanted to come in. They wanted to be part of the process. They wanted to, in effect, agree to a dignified capitulation. And that was turned down by the US and to some extent our Afghan partners, although I think Karzai, had he been felt empowered, would have perhaps pursued a more political solution. But after that, I think that the U.S. has, since 2011, has genuinely sought to bring about peace. And I think that I agree with General Riyaz's assessment that in some ways the Biden administration decision opens doors for us to exert diplomatic influence and to leverage our development assistance and other forms of influence on Afghanistan. I think that one of the tragic flaws of American diplomacy is I think we have become very dependent over time on relying on use of having the potential use of military force in the background as a way of giving us leverage. And I think what we now have to do is refocus and, as I suggested, focus on the region, because I take from most of the remarks of colleagues on the panel that they would not want to see a resurgence of the Afghanistan of the 1990s. Taliban ascendance, I think we all agree that that's probably the most likely scenario, and the specific modalities and political dispensation that will emerge from that have to be determined by the Afghans. But I think the most important thing right now for the United States is to focus on a regional diplomatic forum, if you will, which can be done informally or formally, in which the region as a whole agrees that Afghanistan would not be the subject of proxy wars for the rest of the region, and would not be the subject of intervention and interference from Afghanistan across it. In other words, Afghanistan should not be a threat to any of its neighbors through either, right now I don't think state actors are important, but most principally through non-state actors. So why don't I leave it there? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Durrani, do you have a question? Ambassador Durrani, over to you. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brigadier General. Am I audible?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the esteemed panelists, especially Ambassador Olsen. Good to see you here after longest. As the discussion, in fact, the situation in Afghanistan has reached a very crucial phase, and we all know what are the stakes. I have two supplementary questions to supplementary in a sense that drawn from the discussion. Ambassador Olsen, what do you think that after withdrawing from Afghanistan, do you still intend to maintain bases outside Afghanistan? If that is correct, then the question is, what objectives would the US achieve by maintaining bases outside Afghanistan, what it could not achieve while it has been in the United States for 2 decades? And related to that is that you yourself in your presentation alluded to the the competition with China is likely, US is going to enter. And so does it mean we are now going into, again, an era of Cold War of the yesteryears? So again, we'll have the same actors, and then there'll be us, or either you are with us or against us. Sort of ritual would be repeated. So I would like to be enlightened on your views. Thank you.
Sure. General, should I go ahead and answer?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Ambassador. Good to see you. I would say, on the question of bases, look, here's what I would say. The U.S. is going to continue to have a residual interest in being able to meet its counterterrorism objectives, including, if it's necessary, by kinetic means. Okay. So I think that there is going to be pressure for the United States. I mean, the U.S. has already been talking about an over-the-horizon approach. I think there's a widespread assessment within, what's publicly available in the United States in terms of public information that Al-Qaeda is likely to somewhat recrudesce on Afghan territory. That the Taliban has agreed under its agreements with the United States to prevent its territory being used for planning attacks or actually conducting attacks on the US. And I think is the airline of communication, the ALOC, the Boulevard, whatever you want to call it, which the US has had in cooperation with Pakistan since 2001. On the question of competition with China, whether we're going into a Cold War, that's a topic of very hot debate right now in Washington, and it would be very hard for me to give you a definitive answer as to whether that is going to happen or not. I certainly, from a personal standpoint, hope that it does not, because it is a very different situation from the Cold War, as was recognized, and I think most observers recognize that, the difference between China and the Soviet Union is that China is, by all accounts, going to be the largest economy in the world at some point in this century. By some measures, they have already surpassed the United States. That has not happened for the United States since 1870. The United States became the world's leading economy, largest economy, in 1870. In other words, a good 75 years before the Cold War began, right? So this is a new challenge to the United States. The USSR was never an economic competitor, and it was never an economic partner. China is both an economic competitor and an economic partner, a hugely important economic partner. So I think the U.S. policy, if we assiduously follow our national interests, will be to balance elements of competition and elements of cooperation. And I think that is where the Biden administration is headed. They have already signaled that we're going to need China's cooperation on global warming, which is identified as probably the top international multilateral priority for the administration. I think we have a convergence of interests with China in Afghanistan and perhaps Central Asia as a whole. So I think it would be a mistake for the United States to define this in the same way we defined the Cold War. I will say that the previous administration, I think, was headed in that direction. The previous administration was actually sort of hinting at the idea of regime change in China. That is to say, talking about the Communist Party of China as being a threat. That strikes me as crazy talk, but we'll have to watch this and see. I certainly hope that we do not get into a Cold War type scenario, and I think the Biden administration sees it that way as well.
Right, right, Maheen, you have a question?
Right, sir. I think we covered a bit of this over the course of the discussion, but if you recall, Ambassador Khalilzad had defined the US objective in Afghanistan, and I read, as seeking a sovereign, unified, and democratic Afghanistan that is at peace with itself and its neighbors and does not pose a threat to the world. So do you think that the Biden policy announcement is consistent with this objective and goal? And do you think that there's any leverage that has remained to actually achieve this goal, the US goal?
Mr. Olsen, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. I do think it remains the goal, the aspirational goal of the United States. I think that our leverage has been somewhat reduced by the withdrawal, will be reduced by the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. Which, by the way, at least according to press accounts in the United States, is likely to happen very quickly. I mean, the president said it would happen by September 11th. It looks like now it's going to happen by July 4th, another milestone in the American calendar, at least according to press reports. But I do think that we retain elements of leverage, and I would identify them as being in two areas. First of all, in the broad category of assistance. The Afghan state, as was the case for almost all of its predecessors, is dependent on external assistance. Much of that is provided through multilateral means through the World Bank. And of course, the Europeans play a huge role in providing their own direct bilateral assistance, with the US does as well. And I think the message has been to the Taliban and will be to the Taliban that if the Taliban attempts to impose a complete return to the emirate of the 1990s and takes no account of the changes that have happened in Afghan society over the past 2 decades, including the expansion of rights for women, expanding civil society, the simple fact that you have a young population connected with the outside world, and increasingly urban society. Kabul is a city of 6 million people now. In 2001, it was a city of 200,000 people. If the Taliban takes account of those realities, then that assistance will probably continue to flow. But if it doesn't, if it goes back to the 1990s, then that assistance is going to dry up. The Taliban, I hope they have moderated. It was said in some of the panel members that they are not the Taliban they used to be. I hope that's true. We will see. So that's an important point of leverage. The second point, I would just say that the United States, of course, maintains overall some degree of diplomatic leverage. We continue to be a member of the Permanent Five of the Security Council. That's it will be necessary for the Security Council to approve the complete delisting and desanctioning of the Taliban. So there are, and we retain influence, obviously, to varying degrees with all of Afghanistan's neighbors, even perhaps now with Iran, if we manage to put our relationship with Iran on more of an even keel, which seems to be what the Biden administration is attempting to do. Over.
Right, there's a question from former Pakistani ambassador to Sri Lanka and former Major General Shahid Hashmat. He asked that what kind of incentives is the US and the NATO offering to Taliban not to resort to violence and be part of the Afghan interim government? So, Ambassador Olsen, if you can respond.
Well, look, the core incentive that the US has been offering, of course, is the withdrawal of our forces, which has been, what the Taliban has claimed has been their primary political objective since the early, for the last 20 years. I would say there are also some, narrowly described incentives. I mentioned them before. There's the desanctioning and delisting of Taliban officials, which allow them to travel openly, things like that. But I would say, the really big incentive, and it's not just the United States in this regard, it's the entire international community, is that if the Taliban says, or let me put it this way, if the Taliban lives up to its proclaimed more moderate vision, then it is likely that international assistance, development assistance, will continue to flow. But if not, I think it's very unlikely. And if the Taliban reimposes a very harsh version of their governance that they did in the 1990s, including the complete restriction of women and girls, then I think it's very unlikely that the assistance that will be necessary to run a modern Afghan state will continue. And I think that would have a pretty disastrous impact, not just on Afghanistan, but I frankly think on all of its neighbors, because I think then you would see massive refugee flows. So, I think that there is a considerable incentive for arriving at a political solution, and I would just and a political settlement and an accommodation. And I would hope that anyone who has influence with the Taliban, let me put it that way, would be making that appeal to them at this point.
Right. I have a question from Ambassador Riyaz. Sir, you've written a book on Afghanistan, and you have a very deep insight into the dynamics of Afghan society also. Can you tell us something about the possibilities merging out of Afghan Grand Jirga, its composition, its acceptability, and the possibilities of a future power sharing arrangement emanating out of that?
Well, the Afghan Jirga, it's a time-honored mechanism for reaching decisions in the Afghan society. But if you look at the Afghan Jirga history, usually what happens is that through interaction among the tribals, among other important stakeholders, they reach certain conclusions. And then those conclusions are basically sanctified or adopted by the Afghan Jirga. So it's a process in which first some kind of an agreement is reached, and then this mechanism is sort of works. I don't see that without those kinds of agreements relating to specific questions, like, for example, an interim government or any other issue. But I think the government is a key issue over here which is involved. Unless there is some kind of an agreement among all these stakeholders, there would be a possibility of Afghan Jirga itself getting together and reaching a certain conclusion. So this is what I would say. And in fact, even in my book, which I did in 1990, Untying the Afghan Knot, I said at that time that, well, the Soviets and the Americans have an important role. Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, at that time they were active, so they have an important role. But the success of peace, for peace in Afghanistan, will depend on a coalition of forces which are strong enough to basically counter extremist violence and who are in favor of peace in Afghanistan. Now, that kind of coalition, I find that has not emerged so far. There is only one thing that I would like to add to what Ambassador Olsen had stated, and that was important. He said that now the Biden administration may move into the phase of competition and cooperation with China. That is certainly a good news. But in his first presentation, he had mentioned that for countries, it would be a matter of choice whether they want to go with the Chinese or they want to go with the Western approach. Now, that kind of formulation can really be cause a lot of difficulty for countries like Pakistan, because we would like to have our independent relationship with the United States, and we would like to also continue with our very strong relationship and cooperation with China. And here, when we are talking about China, United States, there are difficulties, one knows all about that. But there is no security threat. There are no security alliances where we should be asked to make choices. Here, it is basically a question of economic cooperation. We would welcome any cooperation, economic cooperation from the United States. We already have important cooperation with China. Similarly, we would like to see that in Afghanistan, the two countries, these two great economies, they should cooperate and help this country, which will also be a great help in nudging the peace process forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And time-wise, as we come to the close of this session, I think we were enjoying, and due to the eclectic mix of the panel, it was a very, very enlightening discussion, and we all stand educated. So before the conclusion, if any of the panelists still wants to add a point or two, we still have a couple of minutes.
If I am allowed, I'll just say a word, and that is, I believe every word what Excellency Ambassador Olsen was saying. But as they say that actions speak louder than words, so we would be very keenly watching the rear guard action of Americans. People did ask questions about the usefulness of bases, what purpose it will be there. So the answer came that it will be to make sure that the negative forces do not crop up in Afghanistan. But if the Americans use these bases to bolster their ally in Afghanistan, that is Ashraf Ghani's government, to fight against Afghan Taliban, then definitely we are not leaving Afghans to their own machinations. And even after leaving, America will be taking sides. That can create a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And in the end, I thank all the panelists for finding time for us and educating us. I think the best takeaways of today's discourse is the acronym CRY. It's a very evocative acronym. C means there's a consensus amongst all the protagonists in the conflict equation and the Afghan drama heretofore that it's time to move on and leave Afghanistan to its future peace. R stands for what General Amir Riyaz formulated, a regional alliance of peace of the regional countries. I think that's a very important point. And third, which all panelists agreed, was incentivizing the Taliban by way of economic leverage and international community's continual engagement to elicit a kind of behavior wherein Afghanistan does not lapse into the same old recrudescence of human rights violations, etc. All in all, a very absorbing session, sir, and we stand educated. I thank all the participants for a very engaging discussion. Thank you very much, sir.